So now we are going to go ahead with the birth of another branch, the priest branch, priest religious, as we call them. Today we are going to see a clip of Father Silvano. I personally met him many years ago, and I was really, really touched by the normality of this person. And since I have to tell you a little bit about him, to introduce you to him, I just read something which he shared in the past. So I'll read it in first person, and it says, "When I was ordained priest, I thought I had already reached human and spiritual maturity, because in addition to the philosophical and theological study which he has taken as a master degree in the seminary, he also studied pedagogy in the University of Turin. Since he was a psychologist, he worked with abandoned children and with the School of Social Psychology and Social Workers." Then he goes on to say, this is before he actually met the movement, met Chiara. "After 4 years of priesthood," he says, "I entered into an intellectual crisis, because I thought that all the philosophy and theology studied was of no use to his ministry." And he says that he thought of leaving the priesthood. He had a friend who was studying in one of the polytechnics in Turin, who was not aware of actually what Father Silvano was going through. Told him, "You know what, Silvano, I've known a movement." And he was not actually very much taken up by the fact that his friend said, "I know a movement." Because in Silvano's mind, being a psychologist, says, okay, a movement, there's a leader, and everyone will follow the leader. So there's no scope for self-realization. But since his friend insisted, he said, "I'll try." So it was when this friend said, "No, Silvano, you are a Catholic priest, and I am a Catholic," this friend said. "I've known a movement, but I don't know if they are Protestants or Catholics. You must know it at least and tell me if I can be part of it." It seems to be a trap, as Silvano said it. And this is when Silvano went to the center, the Focolare, and it was an apartment there. And he met the Focolarina who told him many things. But before this very strange thing happened, this friend and him, they were there in this Focolare without saying a word. The Focolarina said, "See, if you don't speak, she would speak." And that's what happened. And so she asked him, "But you know, how do you spend your day?" Because here, we try to live what God wants us to live. For Father Silvano, as he mentions, he says it was the first blow. I felt my stomach twisted. I wonder what happened to him anyway. But for him, from theory, it was going into a practical aspect. So everything this Focolarina said was, whatever we do it for God, to understand what God wants from him. And so his life in the movement, his contact with the movement started. Now we listen to this clip and see what he has to tell us.
Beside me is Bojan from Slovenia, who is one of the priests in charge of the priest school of Lopiano.
Io sono sacerdote dal 1950. Ho conosciuto l'ideale nel 1954.
I've been a priest since 1950. I met the ideal in 1954 through Angelella, Valle's sister. In a half hour, she succeeded in overturning all my fixed beliefs as a cleric. I wasn't able to sleep for 3 consecutive nights, and then, to avoid going out of my mind, I decided to find out for myself what this new life was all about. I went back to the same house, and there I found Dory. It was an hour of such immense light that I really felt reborn, to the point of singing a Gregorian passage. Like newly born babes, seek the light of wisdom. Naturally, I went to the Focolare every free moment from work. In my first Mariapolis in 1955, at Vigo de Fassa, I saw and spoke for the first time with Chiara. It was an unforgettable moment. I never posed the question of who I was in the movement, because at that time it seemed absurd that priests could belong to a lay movement led by a woman. However, in spite of the work I was doing, I always went around to the various regions with the Focolare to bring the ideal. After the last Mariapolis in the Dolomite Mountains, the Catholic Church decided to separate the priests and religious from the movement because it was still being studied by the Church. The only thing Chiara told us was this: obey the Church to the letter. This is our entire ideal. But no one forbade us priests from meeting among ourselves. So we did exactly this. It was difficult. It was much easier to lean on the Jesus in the midst among the Focolare, but eventually we succeeded. On September 7, 1962, the prohibition was removed. In the summer of 1963, in Turin, we had the first meeting of priests from all over Europe and a few from other continents. It was an extraordinary meeting. The Bishop of Turin, who first came to observe, eventually left me free to serve this movement. I went to Grottaferrata and then to Rome, where I stayed with Father Ferresi. A few moments later, he said to me, "Look for an apartment, because we can't stay together any longer." I found a small apartment on Corso Vittorio. I lived there alone for several months. Finally, I said, "But Chiara doesn't know what I am doing. Chiarato doesn't know anything about me." I decided to write to Chiara. I began the letter, almost jokingly, with these words: "Dearest Chiara, would you like to know something about my Focolare? It's big and full of light." Then I told her how I lived each day. The following morning, a Focolare came to my apartment. She brought me a tube-shaped container and a letter, on which was written, "For Father Silvano." For the Focolare of Focolare priests, Chiara to Father Silvano. Hence, our Focolare was born. The tube-shaped container had a copy of the tapestry of Trent, depicting Jesus washing the feet of the apostles. Chiara wrote, "For the center of the priest branch, living according to this theme, living the Marian priesthood." On September 12, 1966, Chiara founded the priest school for priests and seminarians at Grottaferrata, where all the first schools of the movement began. She gave a historic talk on that occasion. Then, in 1982, a priest school was opened in Tagaytay, Philippines, for the whole Asia, while in March of 2000, the priest school of the Mariapolis Piero in Nairobi was opened for all Africa. In September of 1966, the parish movement was born. On the 1st of April 1968, Chiara founded the Gens movement. In 1974, the two vocations were distinguished: Focolare priests and volunteer priests. That's the end of the story.
It was a very nice experience. Today we have Father Rock, and he would tell us something about himself. Now we'll ask him some questions in any way. So Father Rock is a priest Focolarino, like Don Silvano, like Father Silvano said, right? Father Rock, can you hear us?
Yes.
Good. So it's not an online examination, but it could be just an online sharing. So I think so. All of us would like to know, how you became, what made you a priest Focolarino, how this idea came to you about.
Okay. Looking back, I consider this was a vocation within a vocation. God's call within the call of priestly ministry. I met the movement when I was doing my final year of theology in Papal Seminary, Pune. I was very much interested in knowing the various new movements that were sprouting in the life of the Church after the Council of Vatican II. I realized Focolare movement was one of the fruits. The very first encounter had a tremendous impact on my life. Firstly, I realized profoundly that it was not enough just studying the exegesis of the biblical text, but that I had to take each sentence of the gospel more seriously and then put it into practice in my life by understanding God's plan and fulfilling it by loving, respecting, and helping others. Secondly, I realized that it was not enough just to attend meetings to be part of this movement. But first, I had to live this spirituality, and then only I could share my painful struggles and joyous victories with the others. Thirdly, since unity is so difficult, I realized here that I should not give up the struggle. I found Jesus crucified and forsaken on the cross was the answer and the key to real unity and peace. This was the hidden treasure that I had found, and together with the other priests Focolarini, we would be strengthened in this spirituality of communion so that we could fulfill our pastoral ministry with greater zeal and fruitfulness.
Thanks, Father Rock. Father Rock, I know that you're not alone. You have some other priests Focolarini in India. Could you tell us something more of where they live, what you do, how many times you meet?
We are not many, but very few and geographically far apart. One in Bangalore, the other in Trichy, another in Kerala, and I am in Goa. Meeting often was out of question. Nonetheless, we used to meet together at least once or twice a year to be imbued by this spirituality and to share our struggles and victories, especially in our pastoral fields, where at times disunity abounded. But with God's grace, through this spirituality, we were able to be harbingers of unity and peace in many families, among priests, and even with bishops. With COVID-19, we were able to meet only sometime on Zoom to share our experiences in these trying circumstances. Christ's love is urging us to be creative, to be of help to others, and to find new ways to be united and fruitful.
Father Rock, last year has been a special year for you, sabbatical. Why? And how it has helped you?
Last year has been rather special for me. Around 30 years ago, I had requested our diocesan authority for a break of 1 year due to the course of spirituality of the Focolare movement. Unfortunately, it was not granted then. But I did not give up. In the meantime, I continued in this spirituality, enlightened also by some short-term courses, and I kept on reminding them now and then. Finally, last year, I got the approval for 1 year to be fully with the Focolare program. In consultation with our zone rep, Placido, and worldwide priest branch coordinator, Father Antonio Bacelar, we prepared a program. Last August, September, I participated in the 2-week international scuoletta on the spirituality and Paradise 49 for about 50 priests from all over the world. It was a very profound experience to understand the gift God gave to Chiara. Thereafter, I had a living experience of the life of the spirit of the Focolare at the Priest Center in Rome. Then, from last October to February, I was in Tagaytay, Philippines, for the spirituality course for priests and seminarians, and also for laity with the background of Asian religions. It widened my horizons in understanding the 12 points and the 7 rainbow colors of this communitarian spirituality. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Father Rock. Very wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you for that intervention, Father Rock.
Thanks.
So one of the striking aspects also of the 1960s, as we said, it was full of a lot of life, was the diffusion of the movement's spirituality among brothers and sisters of various Christian churches. It is interesting to note that at the beginning, when Chiara was asked by a well-known personality if the goal of the movement was ecumenical, she very firmly excluded it, as she felt that her charism of unity was for the Catholic Church. The Holy Spirit evidently didn't think so. We'll see some flashes on how the first ecumenical contacts came about. Ecumenical or ecumenism comes from a Greek word, and in a Christian sense, it refers to the whole church in its totality, not being restricted only to one's own church, but searching for a visible unity of the church. So at the Mariapolis of 1958, there was a group of Lutheran women religious from Germany who left quite impressed by their experience. Knowing that the movement was starting in Germany, they invited the Focolare to speak to their community about their life and the spirituality. Now the Focolarini were in doubt whether to accept it because they had no experience and preparation in the ecumenical field. However, they informed Chiara, who, in consultation with a representative from the Vatican, accepted the invitation. In 1961, Chiara went to West Germany and addressed this Lutheran community in Darmstadt. In the audience, there were also 3 well-known Lutheran pastors. After Chiara finished speaking about the spirituality, these pastors were totally surprised and they commented, "What? Catholics are living the gospel?" From then on, the bond with the Lutheran Church started to grow. In 1965, some of them visited Loppiano, and impressed with their experience, they asked Chiara for an ecumenical Loppiano in Germany. A few years later, Chiara inaugurated a center for ecumenical life at Ottmaring in Germany, near Augsburg, precisely where in 1530, the division between Lutherans and Catholics was affirmed. Today, it is one of the Focolare mini-cities inhabited by Catholics and Lutherans, those who have adopted the spirit of the movement while remaining faithful to their own church. In May 1961, Chiara met the Anglican Archdeacon Bernard Pauli, who was in Rome as the Anglican observer at the Second Vatican Council. He was convinced that the movement had a role in being a gospel bridge upon which Anglicans and Catholics could meet. So in 1963, in between the sessions of the Vatican Council, he managed to organize a meeting with Chiara and some observers at the council, including a representative of the World Council of Churches and from the Methodist World Council. After these important meetings, Chiara felt the desire to establish a center, Centro Uno, a center within the movement for Christian unity. In 1966, Chiara was invited to England and had a chance to meet the Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr. Michael Ramsay. Now, the Archbishop of Canterbury is the principal leader of the Church of England and a symbolic head of the worldwide Anglican Communion. At the end of the meeting, Dr. Ramsay said, "You have much to offer to the Church of England. I give you my blessing." Chiara visited England a number of times thereafter. The first Focolare was opened in Liverpool in the 60s. And in the 80s, an ecumenical center at Welwyn Garden City was established. Today, maybe a third of the movement in England is Anglican. From the West, we come to the East. One of the longest running wounds of division in the Christian church was the split between the Eastern Orthodox Church of Constantinople and the Catholic Church. As we saw in the earlier clip, in a historic move in 1964, Pope Paul VI, in between sessions of the Second Vatican Council, made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem and personally met the Patriarch Athenagoras I in Constantinople. The world remembers their fraternal embrace as newly found brothers. Both of them lifted the anathemas, or the reciprocal excommunication, dating back to 1054. It was a new era for interchurch relations. In June 1967, Chiara was invited to Istanbul to visit the Patriarch Athenagoras. He was very interested in Chiara's work of Christian unity and what happened with the Lutherans and the Anglicans, and they struck a beautiful rapport. He used to say to Chiara, "You are my daughter. You have two fathers, one in Rome, Paul VI, and another, an old one, in me here." It was through him that the Focolare movement started to spread among the Orthodox churches of the East. Chiara returned several times to Istanbul and found herself becoming an unofficial intermediary between Paul VI and the Patriarch. This role of hers was important in consolidating the unity between two church leaders and with their successors too. Coming to our times, so what is the experience of our Focolare brothers and sisters belonging to other churches? Let's hear from one of them. Callum Slipper is an Anglican Focolarino.
Nella Chiesa d'Inghilterra.
I'm Callum and I come from England. I was born and grew up in the Church of England. My family was a very practicing Anglican family. At times they were the only ones in church. However, when I came into contact with the ideal, I wasn't thinking so much about the fact that I was an Anglican or a member of any particular denomination. I wanted to follow Jesus, that Jesus whom I found in our midst. But in following this Jesus, I began to understand all the beauties there are in all the churches. And this helped me to understand, as the years passed, the beauties also of the Anglican Church.
Così ho cominciato a capire o rivedere la mia Chiesa nella luce della parte, diciamo, dell'ideale.
And so I began to see my church in the light from the viewpoint of the ideal. And it was truly beautiful. I think that in the future, when the churches will be in full communion with one another, also the Anglican Church will have something to offer.
Però questo non è solo una visione futura.
However, this is not only a vision of the future, because even now, we belong to various churches. But here we are, one, living the same life, a single people who are united.
unico.
In fact, this is the ecumenism of the people, announced by Chiara in 1966 in London, when she saw in front of her a hall full of people of various churches, but united, one, with Jesus in the midst. And as she said that time, if Jesus in the midst unites us, who can ever separate us?
That was Callum. We're almost coming to the end, but we have a pearl which we have left for you to crown this beautiful session, and I ask Ted to take over.
Yeah. So in the first episode of this series, when we covered the 40s, we spoke of Chiara's desire to embrace Jesus forsaken in every suffering. Then she experienced Paradise 49, and when Foucault called her to spread this ideal in the world that was waiting for her, she wrote this beautiful love letter. I have only one spouse on earth, Jesus forsaken. We now introduce you to the second image that she embraced as much as Jesus forsaken. Some of you who visited Chiara's house in Rockety Papa and were privileged to be taken around would have noticed two pictures in front of her bed. One of Jesus forsaken and the other of Mary desolate. Chiara started reflecting and speaking of Mary desolate in the 60s, at a time when the movement was being examined by the church. You've heard this entire thing of the scrutiny that the movement was going through. And it was yet to be approved. Chiara and her first companions and those who followed Chiara were sure that the ideal was a work of God. But was the church in the pre-Vatican II days ready to accept such a unique charism? Now one may ask, what was unique? Firstly, it had lay consecrated people. Then men and women, not as two separate branches of a charism, but one. Married men and women who also desired to live this charism as much as the lay consecrated. Then, headed by a young woman with even a following of priests and religious who desired to live this emerging spirituality. Now, let us also understand the context. That the movement was approved and supported by the Archbishop in Trent, but to spread out into the world, it needed the approval of the church in Rome. This uniqueness came from the many countercurrents that the charism was posing to the church of that time. During these days of scrutiny, Chiara only found consolation in Mary at the foot of the cross, Mary desolate. It is Mary desolate saw the ministry of son end in a way that was not even meted out to criminals. It is Mary desolate who could only stand there and watch her son be mocked and put to death, despite all the miracles, healings, and the good he had done. It is Mary desolate who had to give up her son, who is God, and become mother of John and us all. It is Mary desolate who said nothing at the cross, but at the Annunciation had said, let it be done to me according to your will. This is the Mary desolate that Chiara wanted to imitate and be resolute in following the will of God, appropriate for that time. Chiara saw the church as a mother, and as a child of the church was willing to follow whatever the church saw fitting to approve, even if it seemed it were not as per the design revealed to her by the Holy Spirit. With this background, Chiara was inspired to write this beautiful verse, I have only one mother on earth. A mother she wanted to imitate every moment of her life. In the text that will be read, there are two phrases that may need to be elaborated a bit. The first one is, in her stabat is my staying, in her stabat is my going. Now, stabat means standing rooted at the foot of a cross. And what Chiara is expressing here is a decision to be like Mary. Mary did not understand the need for Jesus, the Savior of the world, to undergo such suffering. Despite that, she was still totally committed to doing the will of God. Chiara too would be firm in seeing the will of God unfold based on the decision taken by the church. The second phrase is hortus conclusus, which is in Latin, garden enclosed and fountain sealed. Now this is a phrase from the Song of Songs. Hortus conclusus means enclosed garden. And here Chiara is referring to Mary as the epitome of all virtues. And Chiara here expresses a desire to grow in these virtues and become more like Mary. But what is most important about Mary Desolate and this entire verse is Chiara's wish that all who are part of the movement become another little Mary. And we have all lived this aspect of Mary, but may not have realized it. We have lived Mary Desolate when we are confronted with sufferings and sicknesses of those near and dear to us. And there's little we can do to lighten their burden. When we have put in a lot of effort sometimes, whether it is at work, working with a community, a parish community, with the SSCs and so on and so forth, or even at home. But what we receive is criticism, ridicule, and of course, suggestions on how we should do things differently and better. When we choose to love in these moments and do the will of God, we become more like Mary. So now let us listen to this beautiful verse from Chiara.
I have only one mother on earth, Mary Desolate. I have no other mother except her. In her there is the whole church for all eternity, and the whole work of Mary in unity. In the plan made for her, I find my own. I will go through the world reliving her. Every separation will be my own. Every detachment from the good I have done will be a contribution to building Mary. In her stabat is my staying. In her stabat is my going. Hortus conclusus, garden enclosed and fountain sealed. I will cultivate her most beloved virtues, that against the silent background of my nothingness, her wisdom may be set ablaze. Then will many of her dearest children, those most in need of her mercy, find her maternal presence everywhere, in another little Mary.